You know, it might seem like something you would just go buy in the store, tomato sauce for pasta, but I guarantee you that you can really make a superior product at home that's also, you know, lower in added sugars, lower in sodium, and just has a much richer, more developed flavor. And it's super easy to make. You can also make it much less expensively. So you have, you know, really inexpensive ingredients like onions, garlic, canned tomatoes or fresh tomatoes. Unless you're using tomatoes at the peak of season, it usually does taste better using canned tomatoes. And if you're able to find ones that have low or no added sodium so that you can adjust as you wish, that's optimal. And then the other thing that we will sometimes add or just have handy would be a little bit of sugar. So depending on the ripeness of the tomatoes, you may need to adjust the acidity with some sugar, and you know, at other times when we make this, we won't. But I'll go ahead and heat up my pan and we'll get started. So I just have a saucepan. Heat up the pan and then I'll turn it down to medium heat. And I'll give you some variations for, you know, more of a standard way of doing it or oil-free. I'm going to saute some garlic and onions in a little olive oil. If you want to do it without the oil, you can just use twice the amount of broth listed as would be oil, which I know is confusing when I say it. So if there's a tablespoon of oil, you would use 2 tablespoons of broth. So you just double the amount it says for oil because you get a lot of evaporation. That's why you double the amount. And it's really just to help prevent sticking. It's not, you know, there's not really any other purpose at this point. You can also just use water. But just because I like that it adds a little richness, I'm going to go ahead and add a little olive oil. Just want that to shimmer in the pan. Turn the heat down a little. I'm going to add my minced garlic and small diced onion. And then one thing I like to do is just add, as long as you're not, you know, really trying to avoid any salt, I'll just add a small pinch or two of salt to the onions and garlic. It helps release the moisture more quickly so that it helps prevent sticking to the pan. When you do that, it allows you to use less oil in the sauteing process. And if you love, you know, to add lots of olive oil to your tomato sauce, by all means go ahead. It just, you know, again, every tablespoon just adds quite a few calories the more that you add. So if you're like many of my patients who are, you know, really trying to optimize and maximize flavor but not add any unnecessary added calories, why, again, we use a little bit, just enough to accomplish the cooking technique that we want, but not any extra. So it's really, really sizzling. I'm turning the heat down a little bit. The goal here is to get the onions and garlic to become a little translucent, meaning that, you know, if you look when you start, they're an opaque white color, and it's getting to where you can imagine that if it kept getting lighter and lighter, eventually you'd be able to see through it. We're not going to get to that point, but we just want it to not be that bright white that it started out as. We want it to be soft and have a little sweetness develop. If your cooking implement allows you to avoid much browning on the onions and garlic, it's nice to avoid that. It'll give you a little more sweetness. If you get a little browning, it's okay. You just might need to cut that bitterness with just a pinch of sugar to balance out the flavors later on. Or maybe you get lucky and have very sweet tomatoes and you don't need to do that. The other thing that you can do is, if you notice things are starting to cook a little too quickly, is you can put the lid on. It captures some of the steam, and that helps to lift everything from the pan. Or you can keep a little water on hand and a little extra broth, and you can just deglaze as you go, and that's another way to slow cooking. Or you can just pull the pan off the heat. This particular burner just doesn't get super, super low, so I'm actually going to add that little broth I had that I was going to use just in case, you know, as an alternative to oil, but I'm actually going to use it to deglaze my pan here. This needs to cook a little bit more before it's really that nice soft quality that we're looking for. So you can really use whatever type of tomato product you want. If you want to use fresh tomatoes, you can do that, maybe blend them up or dice them up fine. A lot of people will peel their tomatoes ahead of time to prevent there being big pieces of skin. That's usually already done if you get canned tomatoes. So I have a combination of what we call crushed tomatoes. So they're peeled, and then tomatoes that are just really ground up. They're not totally smooth like a smoothie, so it's just a little bit of texture left. You can see a few seeds in there, but it's, you know, it's pretty close to smooth. And so I feel like that gives it a nice like saucy texture. And then I like to have a few little chunks. So I have some diced tomatoes here. I like to get the petite diced tomatoes, which are just smaller pieces. Then you don't get a big hunk of tomato. If you're going to cook your sauce down for a really long time, then having the bigger pieces of tomato in the larger size diced tomato is totally fine. But this is just another way to speed up cooking if it's chopped up smaller. Okay, our onions and garlic are pretty much where we want them now, so I'm going to go ahead and add my other ingredients. I have a little bit of Italian seasoning, and this is just the dried, Italian seasoning that you can buy. Buying a higher quality one is going to give you, and just having something that's fresher and newer, 6 months old or less, since it's mostly herbs. Dried herbs don't go bad, they just fade away, is the saying. But especially with these green herbs, if they're more than a year old, they tend to be much more faint in taste. So you might have to use more, or maybe it's time to splurge and go get a new jar. You can also use fresh. You just don't want to long cook fresh herbs into your pasta sauce. You'd want to add those later. I personally think it tastes best with a little bit of the dried, long cooked with the tomatoes, and then topping it with a little bit of fresh chiffonade or finely shredded basil, or some fresh parsley, or whatever other herbs that you like on top of your pasta. So now we have our onions and garlic translucent. We have our Italian seasoning. Now we'll add our tomato product. So we have our crushed tomatoes, our petite diced tomatoes. And honestly, I never make this small a batch at home. I would usually get really large cans of tomatoes, make a stock pot of it, and it freezes really well. So you just get it to exactly the way you want it, freeze it. I usually freeze it in like 2-cup containers, so it's about how much I would want to use with a pound of pasta, and you can freeze it like that. I recommend freezing it separate from pasta. You're going to have a better flavor and texture, and cooking your pasta fresh is much quicker than making sauce from scratch. It says to simmer this from anywhere from 15 to 60 minutes. I would say 15 minutes is the minimum. You just want to make sure you're really hydrating those dried spices. And 60 minutes is by no means a ceiling. It's just most people are going to want to stop and move on and do something else by then. It's mostly hands-off time. But if you had this on a really low temperature that you could walk away from, and you felt confident it wasn't going to burn, then you could certainly stir it every so often and simmer it longer. And the longer cooked, the more concentrated, sweet, well melded the flavors become. And then we're just going to season with a little bit of salt if you've used the salt-free tomato product. And then if it's a little bitter, a little acidic, anything that could benefit from a little bit of sweetness to adjust, just a couple pinches of sugar is usually enough to account for that. And that's it. All right, we'll come back when this is about done. So our tomato sauce is finished cooking, and we had it simmering for about an hour. I'll stir and season it to taste here. So as it was cooking, I actually seasoned with salt to taste already, but I'm just going to kind of look at the level of sweetness or bitterness that's there and adjust that. So it's actually just a little tart, and so I'm just going to add just a pinch of sugar here. Usually just a pinch is enough to balance things out. Taste again. Yeah, it's perfect. It was really just like a small pinch of sugar. So I know some people will say, oh my gosh, you talk all the time about not having a lot of added sugar. Why are you adding sugar to your tomato sauce? And so I just added a fraction of a teaspoon of sugar, really just to balance the flavors. If you had, super ripe, super sweet garden tomatoes, there would just already be enough naturally occurring sugar in there. You wouldn't need any. If you, try to use tomatoes that, weren't canned but were, very underripe, didn't have a lot of flavor developed, you might end up adding quite a bit to equal the level of sweetness that would be in a nice ripe tomatoes. This is really about balancing. It's not about, making something hyper palatable by adding tons of added sugar. And I actually encourage people to have a few ingredients in the kitchen all the time, something with some acid like lemon or vinegar, some salt, pepper, a little bit of sugar, things that you can use to adjust all the different flavors that we taste on our taste buds. So sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. And so having those few ingredients will really be able to take something that, just might be kind of ho-hum and not that exciting, and, just really bring it up to the next level without, very much added expense, and certainly with very little added sugar in the case of the sugar. So we have our sauce ready. We have our pasta noodles cooked and still nice and warm here. And I'm just going to put enough sauce on here to coat, and we'll serve this up. Turn this so you can see this beautiful red color. Since this is a tomato-based sauce too, you can feel pretty good about, we made it without a lot of added salt, just enough. There isn't a ton of added sugar or a lot of additives, so you can, use a lot, because it's just the more you use, the more vegetable serving that you're getting. It's also nice to add something that has a contrasting color. So if you have some, sauteed or roasted vegetables of a different color, maybe some broccoli or, some asparagus, something like that, be a really nice contrast to the red. So we'll bring our serving dish over. And again, I've served a few of these pasta dishes family style now, and I just think it's, it's just such a warming, cozy dish that it's nice to put in something that everyone can share. Okay. And then just for some color, since we don't have those vegetables that I mentioned would be a nice addition, just put a little parsley. And there you have it. We have our homemade tomato sauce.